Okay, this is page 680, chapter 5 test. They tell us that the sine of alpha is 4/5. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Then I find that it's a missing side is 3 using Pythagorean theorem, and it's negative because it's in quadrant 3, quadrant 2, the x is negative. Beta, on the other hand, over here, cosine is 5/13. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. If you do Pythagorean theorem, you'll get 12 for the missing side. Because it's in quadrant 1, everything's positive in quadrant 1. So in question, now we have all the sides of the triangles involving alpha and beta. So I should be able to find what question 1 wants, cosine alpha plus beta. Cosine is cosine, cosine, opposite, so it's minus, sine, sine. If I wrote it wrong, please tell me, or if you think your note card is written wrong, you're allowed to use a note card on Wednesday's test if you have one handwritten. So, what is a cosine of alpha? It is adjacent over hypotenuse. I believe it to be negative 3/5. Do you agree? Cosine of beta, what's cosine? It's actually given up here, isn't it? 5/13. Minus the sine of alpha. What's the sine of alpha? That's given over here as 4/5. And what's the sine of beta? Opposite over hypotenuse. I believe it would be 12/13. So, top times top, negative 15, bottom times bottom, I think is 65, minus top times top, 4 times 12, 48, 5 times 13, I believe is 65, giving me a common denominator of 65. So I have negative 48 and negative 15, so that'd be 63, does that sound right? Negative 63 over 65. Let's check the answer. I'll be right back. Okay, I'll erase this. We'll start number 3. Okay, what does number 3 say? I know it's a tangent, isn't it?
2.
What's 2 say? Ryan, you want 2?
Yes, please.
What's 2 give us?
Tangent. Sir, honestly, it was number 3 because I thought number 3 was 2.
So would you like me to do 3?
Yes, please. No.
Can I do 2 first? Let me do 2 first. Ryan, I'll do 3 also. Let me do 2 first because there are people who are going to want it. Tangent alpha minus beta. Is that correct? Tangent alpha minus beta. Anybody remember the formula?
Same sign, same mean.
Tangent alpha, same sign, tangent beta. 1 minus a product, or actually plus the opposite, right? Tangent alpha, tangent beta. Does that look correct? Okay. Do we know some of these values? I think I know. I don't know any of them offhand, but I do know that you're going to have a minus, and I know it's going to be 1 plus some product. Do you agree? Okay. I need tangent of alpha. What is tangent? Opposite over adjacent. I use the alpha one, right? So would that be negative 4/3? So tangent alpha, I put negative 4/3. How about tangent of beta? Opposite over adjacent. 12/5. 12/5. 12/5. Then from here on it's arithmetic. I believe that's a negative 16/5 divided by, if you added the multiplied, would that be a negative 48/15? What could the 1 be called?
Where we get 16/5.
I'm sorry?
Where we get 16/5.
No, top times, oh, you're right. I can't do that. How do you add or subtract fractions? Common denominator. So do you want to do that up there individually, or do you wish to do it at the end, multiply? It doesn't matter to me. What if we do 15ths right here? Would that be 3 and 3? Would that be, no, it wouldn't. It'd be 5 and 5, wouldn't it? 5 and 5 and 3 and 3. So what would that give me on top then? Would that be a negative 20/15 minus, is that 36/15? which would give me a negative 56/15 on the top, I believe. Now on bottom you have 1 plus, I think that's negative 48/15. That 1 could be called 15/15. So what do you get on the bottom? It's a negative something over 15. I'm sorry?
Negative 33 over 15.
33?
Yeah.
Okay, what's a negative divided by a negative? So I'm not even going to worry about the sign. It's going to be a positive. How do you divide by this fraction? You multiply by the reciprocal? Yes?
Move back a little bit, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, tell me, please. I think these 15s might cancel. And would it be 56 over 33? Let me check the answer. Well, negative over negative turns it into a positive. 3? Is it theta over 2 or alpha over 2 or something?
It's B over 2.
Yeah, beta over 2, so that'd be a half angle. But Ryan, you wanted number 3? Can you tell me what it says?
It says sine of 2 alpha.
Sine of 2 alpha. Does anybody know what sine of 2 alpha is? Is it 2 sine cosine? Am I wrong? So what's sine of alpha? I believe it's given to be 4/5, isn't it? Sine of alpha is 4/5. What's cosine of alpha? So alpha, we're only dealing with one angle. Cosine would be adjacent over hypotenuse, is that right? So would that be negative 3/5? Multiply your tops, what do you get? 8 times 3 is 24, and it's negative, and it's over 25. Okay, what does 4 give us?
Cosine beta.
Cosine of theta?
Beta.
Beta. Okay, beta over 2. Do we know a formula for this one?
Yes.
1 plus cosine over 2 square root.
1 plus what now?
It's the square root of 1 plus cosine over 2.
1 plus cosine.
Plus or minus square root 1 plus cosine.
Okay. That's right. It's plus or minus big square root, right?
Yeah.
And what is it?
1 plus cosine square root alpha.
Beta in this case. Is it over what? 2. And that's under the radical?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have to do plus or minus 1 plus, and it's over 2. Does that look correct so far? Do we know cosine of beta? Is cosine of beta given?
Yeah.
I believe it's 5/13, isn't it? So if 1 is 13/13, what's 13/13 plus 5/13? 18 over 13. And if you're dividing by 2, that could be the same as multiplying by what? 1 over 2? So that's 18 over 13 times 1/2 with a radical. Does 2 go into 18 9 times? So you get the square root of 9 over 13. Is there a square root of 9? 3 over radical 13. Then you would rationalize it because you can't leave a radical in the denominator. And I believe that would give me 3 radical 13 all over 13. Now let me just say I did not put the plus or minus. We have to figure out the sign on this one, right? We want the cosine of beta over 2. If beta is in quadrant 1, where is beta over 2 going to be? If I made it a half right in the middle, what would that be? What quadrant? And first quadrant. And would you agree that everything is positive in the first quadrant?
Yeah.
Write down the formula. Now it's the other way around. You want cosine of alpha sine beta?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. So let's fill this in. Sine of alpha, cosine of beta. 2 of these are given in the problem. Would you agree? What 2 are given? Sine of alpha is sine of alpha. Oops. Is the sine of alpha given?
Yep.
So what am I going to replace in for sine of alpha? I believe it was 4/5, right?
Yep.
What else can I fill in that's given? of beta is 5.
Is that formula right?
I don't think that applies to.
The formula? Let me find the formula.
I thought it was
Sine.
Yeah, it doesn't.
and it's cosine.
What do you have?
Formulas.
It's sine, cosine. I have sine, cosine, then sine. Like I have
Sine.
alpha.
So you have, let me just guess. On yours it says sine of beta, cosine of alpha.
Right.
Now you tell me what the difference is. Their multiplication is commutative, right?
So you're using like the first, you're using like
Yeah,
the two
you're
triangles
using-
from the first four equation for
Yes.
4 problems for number 5.
Oh, we're not using that? Oh, you're absolutely right. This one does not have that, does it? You're right. Thank you. But I have the right formula, don't I?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry about that. What is the sine of what is alpha? 135. Cosine of what's beta? 30 minus cosine of what's alpha? 135 times the sine of what's beta. Beta is 30, isn't it? Do we know any of these values? The sine of 30 is 1/2. Cosine of 30 is radical 3/2. The reference angle on 135 degrees would be what? 45, I believe. Because if I put it at 135, how much further to 180? I believe that makes a reference angle 45. So I look up the sine of 45 and the cosine of 45, and they're the same, radical 2/2. But in this quadrant, what is it? Negative, positive, cosine, sine. So the cosine should be, this cosine right here should be negative. Do you agree with that? So you multiply top times top, bottom times bottom. Negative times a negative is a positive. You have a common denominator, so write it as a single fraction, and you would have this. Any questions on 5? I'm sorry, I was going back to 1 through 4, the alpha, beta.
Isn't it one radical?
Problem 6 is an identity. I break everything into sines and cosines. Cosecant is 1/sine. When you multiply top times top, bottom times bottom, cosine over sine is cotangent, and it does match this. Separate slide. Here's 6. I broke it into sines and cosines. 7 now says what? 7's
X over cotangent x plus tan of x.
secant over cotangent of x plus tangent of x.
Yeah.
And what do they want us to show it equaling? Sine of x? Okay, so they want us to show that this equals sine of x. If you're ever at a loss, that's the best advice I could give you, is change everything to sines and cosines. Secant is 1/cosine. Cotangent is cosine over sine. Tangent is sine over cosine. The top is 1/cosine. In the denominator, you have a fraction. What would be the common denominator in the denominator? Sine of x times cosine of x. What does this first one need to make it into sine cosine? You need cosine over cosine. What would that make in the numerator of the denominator? Cosine squared. On the right, what are you missing? You have a cosine, you need a sine cosine. So you need a sine over a sine, sine times sine being sine squared. Anything so far? What I'll leave the top as 1/cosine of x. Sine squared plus cosine squared, or cosine squared plus sine squared, is 1/sine times cosine. And how do you divide by this fraction. You would multiply by the reciprocal, or if you went to Pioneer, they might have called it stay, change, flip. Sine times cosine all over 1. Will one of these cosines cancel, leaving me sine of x over 1, which I hope matches the answer. Again, your work is the answer. I know it's sine. If you just tell me sine, I can't give you credit. I need to see how you got to sine. Let's look at question 8 now. 7 I broke into sines and cosines and simplified. What does 8 give us?
1 minus cosine squared x divided by 1 plus sine of x equals 7.
1 plus sine here.
Yeah.
And we want to show that this equals sine. Thank you, Ryan. Do you agree to add or subtract fractions? You need a common denominator. So could this 1 here be called something slightly different? Could I call that 1 plus, oops, I'm in the wrong thing, apologize. If I was to call that 1 plus sine x over itself, would that give me a common denominator? I'm just trying to get a common denominator. So the common denominator now is 1 plus sine of x. I have 1 plus sine of x, and I have a minus. And I have a minus cosine squared of x. Let me get the telephone. Goodbye, Joe. Have a good one. 1 plus sine x minus, and it's all over 1 plus sine x. And again, if you're really bad in algebra, you might cancel, but those aren't multiplied. You can't do that. However, whenever you subtract, use parentheses. What can I call cosine squared? 1 minus sine squared, I think. If you distribute, what's 1 and a negative 1? 1 minus 1. 0. What's sine x? Plus, well, negative and negative makes plus, right? So, I'll go ahead and just distribute it. I don't want to confuse people. If you distribute the negative, would that be minus 1 and plus sine squared?
Yep.
1 and a negative 1 add to 0, don't they? So what do I have now? I have sine x plus sine squared of x. Can you factor anything out of that? If you take a sine out, what would it be times? Sine times what is sine? 1. Sine times what is sine squared? Sine times sine is sine squared. Now it's multiplied. So now you could cancel your factors, leaving it as an answer of just sine of x. Number 8, I had to add and subtract. Actually, in this case, I had to subtract fractions, so I needed a common denominator. What does 9 give us? 9 says cosine of, is it alpha? I'm sorry, theta it is. Theta plus pi over 2. As a matter of fact, if you don't mind, I'm going to write it just a little lower so that I can fit the formula on top of it. Cosine of theta plus pi over 2. Now, is there a formula for cosine of alpha plus beta? I think it's cosine, opposite sign, then sine, sine. Now, real fast, let's make sure we know what, if we have pi over 2, which is right up here, what would be the coordinates on the unit circle? Would it be 0, 1? Would they be alphabetical? Cosine, sine. So do you know that the cosine of pi over 2 is 0 and the sine of pi over 2 is 1? The reason I ask is we have to fill these in. And sine, sine. Alpha is theta. But what's beta here?
0.
I believe beta is pi over 2. So you have cosine of theta times something, sine of theta times something. What is the cosine of pi over 2? 0. And what's the sine of pi over 2? So 0 times anything is minus 1 times anything is itself. Does this equal what they wanted us to show it to equal? We just need one formula for sine alpha minus beta. Anybody?
Yeah, I knew it.
What is it? Let me get the door first. Good.
Cosine of beta and then cosine of alpha.
Well, minus the same sign, right?
Yeah.
Then you have cosine alpha,
Yeah.
sine beta.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have on top sine alpha, cosine beta minus what? Cosine alpha, sine of beta. And what is each of these divided by? Sine alpha, cosine beta, sine alpha, cosine beta. Do you agree these could cancel, making it 1 minus? Yes? What is cosine over sine? Cotangent. And what is sine over cosine? I believe this now matches what I wanted it to. Changed everything to sines and cosines. I left a little space so I could get a common denominator between cosine and sine. Would be 1 times the other, so it's cosine times sine. What does the first one need that it doesn't have in the denominator? It has a cosine. It needs both of these. So what's it need? It needs a sine. Top times top, what's sine times sine? Sine squared. What does this one need over here? It has the sine. It needs these. So it needs a cosine. Top times top gives you cosine squared. So at this point, I'm going to rewrite it. And this is going to be times 1 because sine squared plus cosine squared is 1 over this. Top times top is sine cosine. Bottom times bottom is sine cosine. Multiplication is commutative. In other words, the order doesn't matter. So we have it equaling what we're supposed to. Okay, I'm going to modify slightly. We're going to make it, instead of 1 through 16, let's make this, 1 to 16, so let's make it 1 to 15. That way no calculators would be required. And the only thing I might add is one of the ones that has find all the solutions. This one says to find it between 0 and 2 pi. In other words, x can be between 0 and 2 pi. That's what this interval notation means. So first thing I would do, Ryan, is I'd look up what angle sine is 1/2. Put the phone away and maybe we can get it. So what angle sine is 1/2? Pi over 6. We're in radians. It's 0 to 2 pi, so it's in radians. Now, do you agree the angle has to equal that? So if you multiply by 1/3, does that give me an answer? What other quadrants have a negative sign? Now this may not work because what do we have at pi over 6? At pi over 6, is it positive or is it negative? I need the sign, which is the y value, to be negative. So what quadrants would it be in? Quadrant 3 and 4, right? So could this be 7, 6, and 11/6. So I think this has to equal 7/6, because you can't, if you use pi over 6, it's going to be positive. I need it to be negative. So I believe one of the answers will be 7 pi over 18. Do you agree with that? What else might 3x equal? 11 pi over 6. Multiply by 1/3, and that gives me 11 pi over 18. Why might I add 2 pi to 7/6? If I add 12/6, which is 2 pi, it brings it all the way around, right? So what would that give me? 19/6. So 3x has to equal 19/6. Multiply by 1/3, that's 19/18 pi. What if you added 12/6 or 2 pi to 11/6? What would that be? Is that 23 pi over 6? So 3x might equal 23 pi over 6. Multiplying by 1/3 makes 23 over 18. Why am I still going?
Because it's not 2 pi yet.
I haven't got to 2 pi yet. So what else might 3x equal? If you added 12/6 or 2 pi to 19/6, what would that give me? 31/6. Multiplying by 1/3 makes it 31/18. Am I at 2 pi yet? 36 over 18 is 2 pi, isn't it? What if you added 12/6 to this one, to 23/6? 35/6. So you make 3x equal 35/6. Multiply by 1/3 to solve for x. Makes it 35 pi over 18. And I'm going to stop right there. Why? Because you're almost at 2 pi, right? So I think it's these 6 answers. 7/18, 11/18, 19/18, 23/18, 31/18, 35/18 pi. Any questions on 12?
Yeah,
Could sine of 2x be written as 2 sine x cosine x? I believe. Can I factor out a cosine of x? If I take out a cosine of x, does it leave me with 2 sine x plus 1? If something times something equals 0, one of these factors has to equal a 0. So, where is the cosine of x 0? Well, you could look at a unit circle. Cosine is the x value, isn't it? Or the y value. So here it is 0, 1, cosine, sine. And down here it's 0, -1, cosine, sine. So where is the cosine 0? Pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. So I have pi over 2. And I have 3 pi over 2. Now this next one, Marcella, watch this a second. You have 2 sine x plus 1 equals 0. Subtract 1, divide by 2. I have sine x equaling -1/2. How many quadrants will the sine be negative in? Only 2 of them. The sine is the y value. And it would be down here at 7/6 and 11/6. So 7/6 or 11/6. Now 11/6 is almost 2 pi, right? So I don't think we need to go any further. Let me check the answers. Cosine has to pretty much remain cosine. I'd like to change everything to things involving cosines. So sine squared could be called 1 minus cosine squared, I believe. If you distribute this 2, what would you have? 2 minus 2 cosine squared of x plus cosine of x equals 1. So I'm going to add everything to the right. I'm going to add the 2 cosine squared I'm going to subtract the cosine over. And if I subtract 2 from 1, I think it's -1. Does everybody see what I did? I subtracted 2. That gave me the -1 on the right. I added 2 cosine squared, which gave me the 2 cosine squared. And I subtracted cosine. Basically, I made it equal 0. I just moved everything to the right. If you want it on the left, just change all your signs. It'd be the same thing. Now, how do you get 2 cosine squared? It has to be 2 cosine x times cosine of x. What's a times c on this thing? A times c. Is it a -2? What's b? -1. There's only 2 things that multiply to -2. One of them is going to add to -1. Which of these adds to -1? Those 2, right? -2 plus 1. Does 2 here go into one of those values? 2 goes into the -2, and I put the 1 here. So at this point, I do 2 times what equals -2? 2 times what is -2? -1. 1 times what is 1? 1 times what is 1? 1 times 1 is 1. Just like before, if something times something equals 0, I have to set each factor equal to 0. So if cosine x minus 1 equals 0, means that cosine equals 1. Do you know where that occurs? You might be able to look at it on your trig table. Cosine of 0 is 1. Now we have 2 cosine x plus 1 equals 0. If I subtract 1, and now if I divide by 2, I want cosine to be -1/2. What's the reference angle? Cosine is the x value. Where are the x's negative and what quadrants? Quadrant 2 and quadrant 3, I believe, would give me negative cosine values. But what reference angle would it be? Would the reference angle be pi over 3? What's the cosine of pi over 3? Is it 1/2? So what does that make this one? 2 pi over 3. And down here, what would it be? 2/3 more than 3/3 would make this one into 5/3. So there should be 3 answers here. There should be 5 pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, and 0. Let's check this. Do I have, it shouldn't be 5 pi over 3. What should it be? 1. You add 1/3 to 3/3. You're adding 1/3 to 3/3. I believe this should be 4/3, right? You can see how easy it is to make mistakes. Be very careful as you can. Okay, everybody's going to make mistakes. Your goal is to make fewer mistakes than the people around you. That's basically competition, right?